Make no mistake, Sonic's still running strong. With the movie out and some games slated for 2021, you can bet this Blue Hog will be around for decades to come. Ever since its debut in the 90s, Sonic has appeared in tons of gaming consoles, from the SEGA Genesis to GameCube to Nintendo Switch. Sonic's been around for quite some time, but how does his first game hold up? Is it a timeless classic, or a dated piece of junk that was never that good to begin with? Well, today we're going to find out by delving into the game that started it all, Sonic 1 for the Mega Drive / SEGA Genesis. It's impossible to discuss Sonic 1 without getting to the history of Sonic's creation, so here it goes. Back in 1990, Sega ordered Studio to come up with a mascot that could compete with Nintendo's Super Mario. Sega had already toyed with using Alex Kidd as their mascot, but he wasn't popular enough to be a Mario killer. Yeah, good job with the rock paper scissors thing. That's what kids want to play in their video games. Seeing that Alex Kidd was never all that popular, Sega needed a new mascot. They needed something fresh, something exciting. Sega president of Japan, Hayoa Nakayama, wanted a character that would be the next Mickey Mouse, one that would squash that chubby plumber Mario. The Sega Mega Drive was already out on the market at the time, and it still struggled to find its footing, thanks to the popularity of the Nintendo Entertainment System, otherwise known as the Famicom in Japan. It probably didn't help that Sega decided to release the Mega Drive in less than a week from Super Mario Bros. 3 in Japan, which was, you know, the best-selling and most critically acclaimed game of its time. Oops. The Mega Drive would eventually be released in the good old US of A as the SEGA Genesis on August 14, 1989. Sadly, the Genesis struggled to find an audience. Sega tried doing celebrity endorsements like Michael Jackson's Moonwalker and Joe Montana Football. Plus, they had plenty of arcade hits ported to the console such as Ghouls and Ghosts and Gonax. Michael Katz, the president of Sega of America at the time, had the company air a series of commercials slamming Nintendo and praising the power of the Sega Genesis.
16-bit arcade action.
You can't do this on Nintendo Genesis.
Does.
Genesis.
Does.
Genesis.
Does.
Genesis.
Does.
Genesis does.
What Nintendo?
Interestingly enough, the launch of the Genesis Mini would include a callback to that era.
Genesis does.
16-bit arcade graphics.
The 30th anniversary.
Sure, at the time the Mega Drive was a technically advanced piece of hardware, and they had some success with their arcade conversions, but they knew this would only carry them so far. They needed a hit game if they were to establish themselves as a worthy competitor to Nintendo, so a mascot was required. Sega wanted to emphasize the speed the Genesis could offer, so a rabbit was the first idea Sega toyed with. He could run through levels while picking up items with his ears, throwing them at his enemies. This concept would be rejected for the game, but later be used in the 1995 platformer Rise Star, or is it Ristar? Whatever. Instead, they decided to go with a sketch device by game developer Naoto Ohshima. Taking inspiration from classical rubber-hosed characters such as Felix the Cat and Mickey Mouse, his Hedgehog proved to be something special. His classical design, combined with his spiky hair, red tennis shoes, signature grin, and attitude, made him a cooler counterpart to Nintendo's slow, corpulent plumber. In case you were wondering why Sonic is blue, that's because his color was modeled after the Sega logo. Aside from Sonic, Ohshima also designed the look for Dr. Ivo Eggman Robotnik. Unlike Sonic, he wasn't inspired by Felix the Cat, but Teddy Roosevelt of all people. So in the Sonic universe, Teddy Roosevelt is a mad scientist who wants to destroy the environment and make the animals his robot slaves, forever abolishing labor laws. Makes sense to me. Once Sega decided upon the concept, they turned to programmer Yuji Naka to direct the game, being impressed with his work for Phantasy Star and the Genesis port of Ghouls and Ghosts. At first, Sonic the Hedgehog was worked on by 7 people, 2 programmers, 2 sound engineers, and 3 designers. Eventually, more people came on board and Naka would have to work 19 hours a day, as did Ohshima. As this was going on, Sega knew that they weren't going to prosper with Michael Katz taking the wheel, and he didn't even like Sonic to begin with. Luckily, a hero would come out of the midst. One who would save the console and propel Sonic to worldwide acclaim. That man would be Tom Kalinske. In 1990, there was a new sheriff in town. He pushed for stronger marketing and ensured that Sonic would be endearing to everyone, making Sega of Japan get rid of the more questionable ideas like giving Sonic fangs or a human girlfriend model after Madonna. So, once he left, what would Sega do? Give Sonic fangs and a human girlfriend? As we all know, the fans loved it. Programming turned out to be quite an undertaking as there was nothing quite like it at the time. Developers had to make sure that Sonic would keep its momentum and not just phase through walls or stop abruptly. In order to perfect the game, Sega had to delay its release date. You'd think they'd remember to do this for another game with the same title. It's interesting taking a look at the prototype version of Sonic 1. For instance, Labyrinth Zone is the second level of the game, while Marble Zone is the third. In fact, when you enter the level select code, you can see the original order they had planned instead of the final one. I can't imagine what a difficulty spike that would have been, going from Green Hill Zone to Labyrinth Zone. Sparkling Zone has been rechristened to Spring Yard Zone, while Clockwork Zone eventually became Scrap Brain Zone. And does that say Clockwork? On June 23, 1991, Sonic the Hedgehog was released on the SEGA Genesis, and the rest is history.
Sonic the Hedgehog, the hot new game from Genesis Games. Systems and games sold separately.
When Sonic was launched, it received critical acclaim. Electronic Gaming Monthly gave it 4 9s out of 10s, calling it the most incredible action game ever created for the Genesis. The Genesis bundle sold over 15 million copies, and the success of the game would spawn a ton of sequels, as well as cartoons, comics, and plenty of merchandise. It would even go on to win the coveted Game of the Year award, beating out Super Mario World. Megaplay magazine cited as the best Sega adventure yet, describing the sounds and graphics as spectacular, even going as far as to exclaim, "Adios, Mario!" GamePro described it as a class act all the way. It shows what determined programmers, artists, and game designers can do when they really set out to produce a winner. Seeing that Sonic the Hedgehog would sell the Genesis and become one of its most beloved games, the question remains, does it still hold up? When booting up the game, we're introduced to all the staples that made the franchise famous. The colorful backgrounds, the badniks, and the turbo speed that blew everyone's minds back in 1991. Look at that presentation! A fancy title screen with our hero in all his glory, wagging his little finger as if to say, "Hey kids, I'm not like the Italian stereotype, I'm way cooler, I got attitude!" Sadly, many developers would copy the attitude and nothing that made Sonic cool. I'm looking at you, Bubsy! Before we move further, I just want to comment on the box art. I do like the Japanese art, it's quite stylish and upbeat. In fact, you can see elements of that style reflected in the art for Sonic Mania. The box art was designed by Akira Watanabe, and the classic Sonic pose is established. Even though Sonic's skin tone looks a bit light, the colors really do pop. However, if I had to choose, I would side with the American box art illustrated by Greg Ray. Like Akira, he captures the rubber hose style with immaculate precision, and his airbrush techniques give Sonic more of a shine. But what I really like is that Sonic has a bit more of an attitude here, thanks to his mischievous grin and pointed eyes. While the Japanese art is more stylish, the American artwork captures the essence of the game. With the American box art, you get a taste of what you're getting into. Lush scenery, traps, plenty of rings, and one blue dude with the tube. The Japanese art is a nice piece of graphic design, but it's the American art that lets you know that you're going on a grand adventure. Speaking of art, at the time this game was released, the graphics were a tour de force. They were far better than anything you could hope to see on the Nintendo Entertainment System. And they even made Castle of Illusion look like a 12-bit game, and that game was considered an artistic achievement. Sonic's graphics were stylish, creative, and among the best gaming had to offer that year. The game even won Best Graphics of the Year by EGM. Not only were they silky smooth and detailed, they showed off the power of the Genesis with its fast scrolling and rotational effects. No game before had ever moved this fast, and it proved the Genesis could deliver the high-speed arcade thrills Sega said it could. As for the rotational effects, you'll notice in the bonus stages the platforms are constantly rotating. Believe it or not, this was actually a tricky thing to pull off since the Genesis didn't have the Super Nintendo scaling and rotating chips. At one point, developers even found it impossible, but thanks to clever programming, they were able to find a way to make it work and apply it to future games like Sonic and Knuckles. The game's story goes as thus. Dr. Ivo Robotnik, the mad scientist, is snatching innocent animals and turning them to evil robots. Only one tough dude can put an end to the demented scientist's fiendish scheme. Help Sonic fight hordes of metal maniacs. Do the loop with a supersonic spin attack. Spin through space. Loop till you're dizzy. Save the animals and become the superhero. Be Sonic. Be atomic. When it came down to the levels, we first started with Green Hill Zone. This was the first stage that most people saw, whether at a friend's house or a kiosk at your local Toys R Us, and boy did it make an impression. With its sparkly clear waterfalls, scenic mountains, bizarre foes, polygon palm trees, totem poles, and spinning flowers, gamers knew they were in for something special. Sure, it's easy to take Green Hill Zone for granted now, but at the time there was nothing like this. The feeling that gamers got wasn't that they were merely playing a video game, they were entering a whole new dimension.
To journey into the mega world.
Welcome to the next level.
The zone is bursting with life as there are so many little pieces of animation like the waterfall in the background, the way the lake shimmers, and the way the flowers spin. And that's not counting the bad next to the animation Sonic himself does! These things may seem minor, but they had a lot of personality to Sonic 1, and putting in this level of detail would have been unheard of in an NES game. The added power, memory, and graphics enabled the Genesis to do things that previous generations could never do, and even Super Mario World appears bland by comparison with its static backgrounds and minimalist detail. Of course, we can't rule out the checkerboard walls. They too played a huge part in making Green Hill Zone iconic, and they would become the aesthetic choice for many future Sonic games. The checkerboard pattern was inspired by 3D graphics and texturing, so Sega wanted to infuse that 3D look to Sonic to make it appear more next generation than Nintendo's aging console. All the huge indents in the walls also helped to establish a sort of 3D look that gave depth to the backgrounds. Visually speaking, Green Hill Zone is very busy, but it's not so much that it's hard to tell what's going on. The colorful graphics, teamed with the catchy tunes and high-speed gameplay, served as the perfect introduction to Sonic's world. If Sonic 1 began with Labyrinth Zone or Scrap Brain Zone, there's no way this game would have been nearly as popular. Sega knew they had to make a solid first impression, and this was the level that sold people on Sonic. Marble Zone, on the other hand, isn't nearly as busy, and the color limitations are more obvious as the zone consists of the same shades of purples, greens, and reds. The outdoor look is fine, but the indoor look is rather plain. Overall, it's not a terrible looking zone, but it looks kind of dull compared to the one before it. Spring Yard Zone, on the other hand, is another one of the more interesting zones as it's a cross between a giant pinball machine and a dark urban city. The flashing lights, pinball bumpers, and glowing words would serve as the predecessor to future stages like Casino Night Zone. However, the limitation of the color palette is in full display, as you'll mostly just see orange, purple, and green. It's not bad for an early Genesis game, but later games would discover how to expand the System 64 colors at a time to over 100. A good example of that would be Toy Story. You'll notice a few familiar badniks returning to the zone such as Crabmeat and Buzz Bomber. However, the one baddie that sticks out is Roller. Seriously, when I first saw the demo of this, I thought I was seeing two Sonics on screen. They would later change its color to red in Sonic Mania, although I'm not sure why. Another thing that's noteworthy is how dark some of these levels look. It's not Streets of Rage dark, but compared to the bright-looking later Sonic games, there are some levels that have this sort of underground aesthetic that you saw in a lot of Genesis games at the time, mainly because Sega of America wanted to appeal to the older crowd. Labyrinth Zone is a decent looking zone with some pretty good water effects for the time, especially if you have the Japanese version. The backgrounds in Starlight Zone have this underground look I was talking about, and they wouldn't look out of place in a Streets of Rage game. The green makes the foreground stand out and easy to maneuver though. As for Scrap Brain Zone, it's Robotnik space, so naturally it's cold, mechanical, grimy, ugly, polluted, and a bit dark. Unlike Green Hill Zone, there are no signs of life, no vegetation, no joy. You can even see the little bursts of flames rising up from the chimneys and traps everywhere, letting us know that we have reached the final chapter. Once you get inside the base, you can see subtle little touches like the face on the wall. It's less an evil lair and more of a death trap as the zone bombards you with obstacles every second. The third act is just Labyrinth Zone with a different coat of paint, but it's a polluted version as the hideous color tone would indicate. Oddly enough, Scrap Brain Zone is the only zone where each act looks different. Each zone is divided into 3 acts, and I have to admit I was never particularly fond of this structure. Sonic 2 proved that 2 acts were enough, whereas with 3, the levels seemed to overstay their welcome and you want a change of scenery. I assume they use the 3-act structure so they can recycle assets more easily and not have to worry about creating more levels. Creating more zones would require their own enemies, traps, gimmicks, and art style, something they didn't have time for since it took Yuji Naka 8 months to perfect Green Hill Zone alone. I should also mention that Sonic 1 was developed on a 4MB cartridge, so it's not like there was a lot of room for data. With that in mind, it's not surprising to see enemies reappear in later stages. Because of the small cartridge space, you saw a lot of repetition with early Genesis games like Streets of Rage, where you're forced to fight the same bosses over and over again. With later games like Sonic 3 and Knuckles, you see stages change visually from one act to the next, and sometimes they'd incorporate huge changes within the act itself. I know it's not fair to compare, but I really do appreciate how later Genesis games had bigger cards that enabled the developers to do more with their software in terms of graphics, animation, gameplay, sound, and storytelling. The increased data will lead to bigger, grander, greater things. Well, not always. As for those special stages, they're so magnificently trippy! You think Sonic was on something. Could it be speed? Seriously, you have to wonder what they were on when they conceptualized this. This is one of the most psychedelic moments of the series, and the way the 3D birds transform into fish is an impressive feat for 1991. The art deco in Sonic 1 is nice, and another thing that makes the art stand out would be the characters. Sonic himself is well animated, and his classic Felix the Cat inspired appearance looks great to this day. His personality is given a chance to shine once you put the controller down. I love how he just stares at you, tapping his feet as if to say, "Yo, what's the holdup?" This one little piece of animation is a perfect demonstration of Sonic's character and the attitude Sega managed to sell to gamers worldwide.
Sonic, he's got an attitude.
Sonic was fast and cool, so he didn't need you wasting his time. The enemies are no less memorable with creatures such as Crabmeat, Buzzbomber, Caterpillar, Chopper, and Roller. Of course, one of the biggest triumphs would have to be Dr. Robotnik himself, as his elaborate mustache and egg-shaped body helped make him one of the game's most recognized baddies. There's a lot of character to him, whether he's cackling with sadistic glee, panicking when getting hit, or just plain embarrassed by his most recent defeat. Overall, the sprite art may have aged, but the design is still solid, and it really went a long way in defining the look for the series. I admit that Sonic 1 has become harder to appreciate since Sega keeps reusing Green Hill Zone every chance they get, weakening its impact, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the art is still a lovely piece of work. The music was composed by Masato Nakamura, and while the Genesis sound chip is as impressive by today's standards, Nakamura took advantage of the machine's capabilities to the max. The Super Nintendo may have had superior instrumentation, but that didn't stop composers from doing great things with Sega's machine. Every stage has a memorable ditty, ranging from Green Hill, to Starlight Zone, and of course, who can forget the title theme?
Sonic the Hedgehog, you can't catch what you can't see. Sonic the Hedgehog, he's gonna make Mobius free. He's a teenage fugitive on the run, eating chili dogs by the ton. No matter how frantic the chase becomes, there's always time to have some fun. Sonic the Hedgehog.
The tunes really brought the game to life and were instrumental in making Sonic a household name. Standout tracks would include the ever-famous Green Hill Zone and has the right amount of pep you'd expect from a Sonic game. There's definitely a sense of adventure to keep you pumped. It's upbeat, but not to the point where it sounds like you're celebrating prematurely. Marble Zone has a sort of playful melody to it, but within the notes you can still feel a sense of danger. Spring Yard Zone is a nice perky tune with some awesome drum work and bass. The Bluegrass music in Labyrinth Zone is a nice change of pace from the other themes we've heard so far. I admit Bluegrass isn't the type of genre I'd normally associate with Sonic, as rock and jazz are better suited, but it works. Starlight Zone has a dreamy, relaxed atmosphere to it, not unlike the American version of Stardust Speedway. It's one of the best songs in the game, and you can see why it was remixed in Sonic Advance 1. When it comes to the special stages, they just make me feel so high, like a diamond in the sky. As for Scrap Brain Zone, it has this ominous machine-like rhythm that lets you know the endgame has arrived. Composer Masato Nakamura wanted the songs to have a cinematic quality to them, and I think this is a really good example, along with the Final Zone theme. Back in the day, it wasn't common for games to sound cinematic. It's not as though you could hire an orchestra and expect the music to be played unfiltered. Concerning what he had to work with at the time, I have to give him mad props. For those who don't know, Masato Nakamura is part of the band Dreams Come True, which was formed in 1988 and sold more than 50 million records internationally. During his interview for Sonic Retro, he described his involvement as being quite an exciting time, mainly because Sega was taking on the big N. By the way, did you know that the music for Sonic 1 was done on an Atari computer?
This has been another useless fact.
At the time, there was a strict limit on the number of sounds available, and there were fewer of them that could play simultaneously. In fact, Nakamura only had 4 sounds he could play at a time. Again, it wasn't helped by the fact that Genesis cartridges had limited memory, so he couldn't make the songs too long or complex. The fact he was able to write so many catchy tunes with all these limitations is a testament to his sheer talent. When it comes to music, I have to say that Nakamura passed with flying colors, or should I say, flying rings? Some people may give the Genesis flack for its sound chip, but when put in the hands of talented composers such as Nakamura, Yuzo Koshiro, and Tommy Tallarico, they could do wonders with it. That's all well and good, but how does the game play now? The gameplay for Sonic 1 is simple. You run as fast as you can and get to the end of the level without dying. You collect rings to gain a 1-up, and they can even be used as a safety net. Along the way, you smash badniks and you avoid traps. If you collect 50 rings by the end of the stage, you can get the Warp Ring. That sends you to the special stage where you collect the Chaos Emeralds. Catch them all to get the true ending. You can also snag a blue shield that will enable you to take a hit but not lose any rings, and it's incredibly handy for entering the Warp Ring. Control-wise, it's great! Sonic controls as perfectly as he should. A lot of attention and care went into the game's physics, as you can build up enough momentum to propel yourself to incredible speeds, unlike Sonic 4 where you can just simply walk up walls. Apparently, you can run on ceilings. So Izuka, what was with your claim that ceiling running couldn't be done in the classic games, huh? Answer me! The loop-de-loops, curves, and slopes create a sort of momentum that had never been done before. At least not to the degree that Sonic 1 did. They even include some pinball physics for good measure. Before that, you would mostly run in a straight line in platformers. Yeah, some games like Super Mario Bros. 3 had slopes, but the momentum never carried to Sonic's level. Speaking of Mario, there is a lot of that Mario influence embedded in the game's layout, whether you're jumping on enemies' heads, propelling yourself on springs, racing the clock, dodging jumping fireballs, avoiding spikes, and having invincibility power-ups. Like Mario, you collect things to get a 1-up, only it's rings instead of coins. However, it's not such a bad thing. If you're going to take inspiration from something, you might as well take it from the best. The only time it gets troublesome is when you're forced to do some slow platforming that will work fine in a Mario game, but not a Sonic game. Before Sonic, Mario was king and no one could touch him. Yet this prickly blue punk came along and gave him a run for his money. The ability to run this fast in a game was never attempted before, so seeing this for the first time was such a breath of fresh air that people went nuts for it. It was fresh, it was novel, it was exciting, and more importantly, it was fun. The best moments in Sonic 1 are when you're blasting through like a rocket. There's still something to this raw energy that has endeared the Blue Hog even to this day. Even better is when you find the invincibility and power sneakers at the same time. Another thing I've always appreciated about the series were the alternate pathways you can take. Even if you're beating the game, you can always choose a different route and see what new paths you can discover, seek out hidden power-ups, and discover new secrets. I like it when games do this as it adds quite a lot of replay value, seeing what you missed the first time. Another key aspect of Sonic 1 is how it rewards the player's finesse. For instance, when you try to get to the top at Green Hill Zone, it can be frustrating at first, but when you master it, you're rewarded with a ton of rings you can use to access the Warp Ring at the end. Another example is when you first go up against Eggman. If you're skilled enough, you can smash the invincibility monitor hidden in the tree and just wail on him. If you explore your surroundings and experiment with the game's controls, you can find extra lives, shortcuts, or nice power-up to make your quest a little easier. There's satisfying little moments that add to the game's fun. For fun, you can even activate debug mode. This cheat enables you to scatter rings, enemies, obstacles, and platforms all over the level. Sonic was doing it way before Mario, so take that, Nintendo! Okay, so it's not as robust as Mario Maker, and you still have to go through the same levels, but it's a cool little feature regardless. The only problem is that things you place will vanish if you stray too far, so that's a bit of a letdown.
Watch as I take on Robotnik's mecha army of death!
Having trouble fighting Robotnik? No sweat! Just place a bunch of platforms underneath and smash him! Apparently Robotnik doesn't care that I'm right here beside him. That's right, keep giggling like a moron! The speedy bits are still fun, but it's also a point of contention among some gamers. One of the most common criticisms about the series is that you mostly just hold right to win, requiring very little input from the player. In all fairness, Sonic 1 does throw a lot of enemies and obstacles your way, so you do more than just press right. Sure, Sonic doesn't get to do as much as Mario since he can fly, swim, ride a dinosaur, shoot fireballs, throw objects, and create blocks. With having less to do, some people have found the series to be boring, but Yuji Naka's design philosophy was to make Sonic simple. If Mario should use 2 buttons on the NES, then Sonic should use 1. While I applaud Yuji Naka for making Sonic accessible to all gamers, his simplification philosophy came at a cost. Once you got over the novelty of blazing past levels at Mach 7 speed, you began to realize the game is more about style than substance. The adventure is relatively short, and even though the zones offer their own gimmicks, there's not a whole lot of variety in the gameplay as it's just run, jump, spin, repeat. However, that's not the main problem. One of the biggest sticking points to Sonic 1 would have to be the slow levels. After blazing past Green Hill Zone, you're forced to travel through Marble Zone, where you come across slow-moving platforms and lava that get in your way. The speed picks up again in Spring Yard Zone, but even then you're constantly bombarded by traps, so you don't have the same amount of freedom you did in Green Hill Zone. Just when you thought you saw the slowest moments of the game, you were then treated to Labyrinth Zone where your forces move at a snail's pace, thanks to, oh, that water. Oh gosh, the timer, I gotta get it, come on! You son of a... After hearing the countdown to your nightmares, you're rewarded with a fast level once more. Even though it has its share of enemies and bottomless pits, it's still a relatively easy zone to get through. We finally get to Scrap Rain Zone. You know, the zone that actually punishes you for going fast. I mean, look at this! When you have buzzsaws flying over your head, you have to dodge fire, electromagnetic conductors, collapsing floors, crushers, and a crap ton of badniks. If you speed up, you'll instantly die! Rumor has it that Sonic 1 was originally going to be faster, but Yuji Naka decided to tone it down since he got motion sickness. Also, there were disagreements among the staff with some claiming the game was too fast. Personally, I just wish he hadn't slowed the game down since Labyrinth Zone and Scrap Rain Zone really dragged the pace down. Sadly, they would make the same mistake in Sonic Adventure games by substituting annoying gimmicks for speed. Why couldn't they have put you to sleep? It's not to say that the slow levels are bad, they just lack the excitement that Green Hill Zone and Starlight Zone have to offer. I can appreciate the added challenge in areas like Scrap Rain Zone, but it would be so much better if they didn't force me to go at a snail's pace. If you get 50 rings by the end of an act, you can jump through the giant ring that warps you into the special stage. Now, I have a problem with this, since getting the warp ring drags the pace down by forcing you to move slowly and collect a bunch of rings without getting hit. It's not so bad in the first few levels since there are plenty of rings and few traps to worry about, but once you enter the later zones, you have to tiptoe your way across without getting hit. It is especially annoying if you don't know your way around the levels. If this is supposed to be such a fast-paced game, then why is SEGA constantly shoving crap that slows you down? Okay, I have 50 rings now, better not screw this up. Gah! As for the special stages themselves, they may look cool, but they're pretty weak. Controls are frustrating since everything keeps tilting and you're given a very limited view, making it all too easy to hit the goal bumpers. Some of them you have to rely on memory since it's so hard to see where you're going. They're not very fun, and it's hardly worth it to get all the Chaos Emeralds since all you get is an alternate ending. It's not exactly riveting, and it's on par with Super Mario Sunshine's extra ending. Those are 30 hours of my life I want back, Nintendo! The special stages are okay if you're looking for an extra challenge or if you want to change of pace from the action, but later games of the series would do it so much better. Of course, Dimps had to bring back the Sonic 1 special stages in Sonic 4 because everyone liked that, right? Right? By the end of every third act, you come face to face with Robotnik as he attacks you in some kind of mech. The most famous one would have to be the record checker ball you have to dodge. Most of the boss fights are pretty lame as I was able to take them out in less than 2 minutes. You'd think that Robotnik would invest in some tougher armor. Who knows? Maybe he's secretly a masochist with a hedgehog fetish. That would explain his blushing face.
I only want that hedgehog.
Labyrinth Zone features one of the few challenging boss fights, yet it's not even a boss fight because Robotnik doesn't even attack you. It's a really odd battle since it's the environment that makes it dangerous, not the actual antagonist. It's also the most frustrating battle since you have to watch the timer while avoiding all those traps. One of the better bosses would have to be the Starlight Zone one since it gives you the option to attack in 2 different ways. 1 by catapulting yourself, and 2 by launching the bombs at him. I would have liked to have seen more boss battles like this since having more options to attack adds a bit of spice to the fights. Sadly, there aren't many like this in the classic series. Finally, we get to the final boss and it has to be the weakest one in the Genesis trilogy. It all boils down to Robotnik trying to crush you while firing some bolts at you. No giant robots are supersonic. Whoopee. It's hard not to miss things like the spin dash if you're playing the original version, plus some of the enemies are really cheaply placed. Despite Sonic 1's flaws, it's still a fairly enjoyable game. Even the slow-moving sections have some decent platforming. If I were to grade the game on the amount of fun I had when I first played it, I would rank it a 10 out of 10. As it is, time has caught up with it and the flaws are more obvious. Blasting through levels at lightning speed is no longer the novel concept it was back in 1991. plus the sequels managed to improve on it in every aspect. I do have to cut Sega some slack though. They were pioneering a new gameplay style, so they were in uncharted territory, not sure how to approach it. They would learn from their mistakes and learn to incorporate better graphics, deeper storylines, faster gameplay, and improved level design. Seeing that Sega released this game so many times, the question remains, which one should you pick up? For $5 a pop, it's a fair deal on Steam. Unfortunately, it's the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis Classics version, and it's hardly the ideal one. A common complaint among the Sega Classic series is that they feature constant slowdowns that were never part of the original games to begin with. It's especially apparent with Sonic, plus some of the sound is off. The original Sonic games may have had some slowdowns, but here they're more frequent and it's quite jarring, especially for a game that's supposed to go fast! A better version would be the Sega Ages version that was designed by M2, the same guys who made ports of classic games like the Streets of Rage series, Collection of Mana, Contra Anniversary Collection, Phantasy Star, and more. These guys really know their stuff when it comes to porting classic games. The Sega Ages version not only perfectly emulates the original game, but they added new features as well, such as the spin dash, the ability to save, and even the drop dash move from Sonic Mania. The drop dash move is a brilliant feature that really comes in handy for getting out of tight spots and bringing more speed to the original game. Of course, it's not worth buying the game just to experience the drop dash if you played Sonic 1 dozens of times before, plus it seems to work better in Mania than it does here since Sonic 1's engine wasn't built with it in mind. However, if Sonic Mania was your introduction to the series and you just can't live without the drop dash, then by all means get this version. If you're a purist who wants to experience Sonic 1 without those fancy bells and whistles, you can just disable the drop dash and spin dash. What's great about the Sega Ages version is how friendly it is to newcomers and amateur players. You not only have the ability to save and select a stage, but you can also play Ring Keep mode. If you're struggling with the game, then no sweat. Ring Keep mode will start you off with 10 rings, and even if you get hit, you only lose a few rings instead of all of them. Remember all those times in Sonic 1 when you worked your butt off collecting 50 rings to get to the warp ring at the end of the stage, just to see them vanish instantaneously? With Ring Keep mode, you only lose a few here and there, making it easy to recover more rings and still stay on target. There are plenty of other features too, like changing the dimensions and playing with scan lines to replicate old TV sets. And let's not forget Play Replay, where you can watch footage of your playthrough. You can switch between the Japanese version and the international version, the difference being the Japanese version having more graphical updates like the moving clouds, water ripple effect, and more parallax scrolling. The Sega Ages version is great for show-offs who want to see their names in the rankings, plus there's even ring chain display. With this mode, you can keep track of how many rings you can collect without getting hit. Now you can become the true Lord of the Rings.
My precious.
What's more, the good folks at M2 even include the Mega Play version of Sonic 1. The Mega Play version is basically the arcade version of Sonic 1 with a stricter time limit. There are a lot of differences, such as the fact you can only get 3 lives, you can't earn any more, or the fact you can only play 4 zones: Green Hill Zone, Spring Yard Zone, Starlight Zone, Scrap Brain Zone, -1 act, and Final Zone. You can't enter the special stages, nor can you collect the Chaos Emeralds. I'm guessing they designed it like this to entice kids to want to buy the full game. It's a weird inclusion, but you can't get it anywhere else. The Mega Play version feels more like a demo than anything else, but it's a nice addition if you want to challenge yourself. Speaking of challenges, Challenge Mode is very disappointing as there are only 2 challenges, Time Attack and Score Attack. With Time Attack, you're only given the option to complete the first act of Green Hill Zone. That's it. You know, with Sonic Mania, you could use Time Attack mode in just about every stage, but here you're limited to just 1. As for Score Attack, it's just the Mega Play version with 1 life allowed. You'd think they give you a whole bunch of challenges like getting 50,000 points, killing a number of badniks, collecting 200 rings by the end of the stage, or something. Instead, we're given a bare bones challenge mode that doesn't really add much to the experience. I have to say that the SEGA Ages version is very solid, although there are times I feel they did too good a job at emulating the original game. Some of the game's original glitches and slowdowns are still intact, so it would have been nice if they had fixed that. As good as the SEGA Ages version is, if you want a more authentic experience, you can always pick up the Genesis Mini version as it's perfectly emulated and those wired controllers will help you relive the 90s! Not only that, but you get a whole bunch of cool games like Sonic 2, Streets of Rage 2, Earthworm Jim, Castle Illusion starring Mickey Mouse, Gunstar Heroes, ToeJam and Earl, Mega Man The Wily Wars, Street Fighter 2, and so much more. The Genesis minigames were handled by M2 once more, and they did a fantastic job with this anthology. The games play true to the originals, and you're given a bunch of features such as save states and the ability to play in full screen, and you can even switch around the regions. I would have liked the ability to rewind games like the Super Nintendo Classic, but that's a small price to pay when you consider the Genesis Mini has more games than the Super Nintendo Classic. Of course, we can't exclude the mobile version. It's wonderfully remade by Christian Whitehead, the same guy who would go on to make the ever-popular Sonic Mania. The sound has never been better, the frame rate and graphics have never been smoother, plus it's in widescreen. Being able to see more of the action really helps when you're collecting rings and dodging enemies. What's more, you can even do the spin dash. No more having to climb those steep slopes. Thanks to the widescreen effect, even the special stages are more manageable as you have a better sense of where you're going than you ever did in the original. Yes, you can use the widescreen effect on the SEGA Ages version and the Genesis Mini, but all that does is stretch the image out and it's nowhere near as appealing. With the mobile version, they actually revamped the graphics to appeal to more modern sensibilities, plus they even added a few touches to widen the screen while being faithful to the original source. A good example of that would be the gate that blocks you in the third boss fight. If that weren't enough, Robotnik even moves faster during the fights, making them even more intense. It's a welcome change of pace that adds more to the challenge. Plus they nixed the free hits you could do in the original version. What's more, they even updated the graphics. In the special stage, everything rotates faster and more smoothly. Another small touch I like is how the music fades from one scene to the next, instead of being abruptly cut off like in the original version. With a mobile port, it feels as though I'm playing Sonic 1 as it was meant to be played. To make things even sweeter, you're given the ability to unlock Tails and Knuckles. Why couldn't they do that with the lock-on cartridge? Back in the day when you plugged in Sonic 1, or any other non-Sonic game, into Sonic and Knuckles, all you got was Blue Spear. By the way, Tails really breaks this game, thanks to his ability to fly and swim. He removes most of the challenges the game was designed for, but he's an optional character, so that's forgivable. Easy gameplay has its place in video games too. As for Knuckles, he still has that low jump that's been a staple since Sonic and Knuckles. He can get annoying in places, but it's more tolerable here than in Sonic 2. Like before, he can break down walls and they even added a few secret paths he can take. The best example would be Marble Zone, as it's so refreshing. I have to applaud them for going the extra mile. They could have just slapped Knuckles in the game with no changes and that would have been fine. Of course, if you yearn for the old days, you can always pair Sonic and Tails together. Not only will Tails collect rings and beat badniks for you, you can even use them to give you a lift. It's a handy little feature and one they would copy for Sonic Mania. As expected, there's time attack, achievements, and the ability to change the box art to a different region. The touchscreen controls are perfectly functional, but nothing beats using the Genesis pad. If you're going to play the mobile version, get a controller. With that said, I wish the Christian Whitehead version was available on Steam and consoles, as it is the best version, but the SEGA Ages version is pretty good too. Interestingly enough, the only thing missing in the mobile version is the drop dash move. It's ironic considering Whitehead and his team were the ones who have introduced it. Then again, this did come out before Sonic Mania. If you want the best version, go with the mobile port. If you're one of those people who can't live without the drop dash, or just want to play it easier, get the SEGA Ages version as it's designed to appeal to newcomers. If you're into retro games and want a whole bunch in one tidy little package, get the Genesis Mini version. It's a great system even if you're not a fan of Sonic. However, if you're a collector and you want the real thing, get the Mega SG and a copy of the original cartridge. I mean it! The Mega SG is awesome! You can play all your favorite SEGA Genesis games in glorious upscaled HD. The games look great and the wireless Genesis pads are perfect for those who don't like having to sit 3 feet away from the TV. You can even use them for PC and gaming consoles like the Switch. When it comes to graphics, the Mega SG manages to edge out the Genesis Mini as the colors are a bit more vibrant. Sonic 1 is a good game, but when you really look at it, much of its success was due to the marketing. Not to deny credit to Yuji Naka and the rest of the staff that worked on it, but much of the credit has to go to Sega CEO Tom Kalinske and Director of Marketing Al Nilsson. These two men saw Sonic's potential and marketed the heck out of Sonic. In fact, when Tom Kalinske recommended they take out the Ultra Beast game for the Genesis pack-in, Sega of Japan went ballistic and criticized him. Luckily, the Japanese president had the good sense to let him have his way, thus Sonic became a star. Let's face it, if it weren't for Kalinske and Nilsson, Sonic 1 would just have been regarded as a cult classic for a failed console that just couldn't battle the mighty Nintendo. Sure, it may have gained a small but loyal fan base, but that would have been enough to support a game series, let alone a console. Without Sega of America's aggressive marketing, the series probably would have stopped with just one game. Thankfully, it didn't happen that way. Sonic 1 may not be the best game of the series, but if you're a Sonic fan, you owe it to yourself to at least try it and see where it all began. It's still a fun experience, and it built a foundation that later games would improve on.